Welcome to the Flash Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we're actually going to talk about timer events in ActionScript 3. This is actually a two-part series, so this is part one of the timer events tutorials. Another useful event in ActionScript 3 is the timer event, and I'm sure that you remember we just finished up the mouse events. And mouse events are very important for interaction with our users, but another very important event is the timer event in ActionScript 3. Time-based events in ActionScript are measured in milliseconds. That is, they're measured in 1/1000th of a second. They fire very quickly. They do not vary from scenario to scenario. They're fixed. It's very precise timing. They're reliable means of timing actions in ActionScript, and they're very consistent. Previous versions of ActionScript use a method to accomplish this called the set interval method. This method was used to trigger reoccurring events inside of ActionScript. There was also a method called the set timeout method for triggering a finite number of occurrences inside of ActionScript. The new timer class in ActionScript 3 replaces these previous methods and simplifies the process of using timers in ActionScript 3. In order to use the timer class in ActionScript 3, you must first create an instance of the class in your ActionScript 3 code. We do this in the following way. We actually set up this instance of the timer class, and I'm going to break down exactly what this means. I do want to point out that I've added a lot of additional space in here, like between the colons, between the commas, and I did that for clarity, just so it's easier for you to understand what we're talking about and what areas I'm talking about. The spaces are not required when you actually enter it into your code. So the first thing, we set up this variable called myTimer. We declare a new variable called myTimer, and you can name this anything you want. The variable name could be any name that you choose. Remember that once we do this, we end the declaration with a colon, because then we're going to data type it. We're going to data type our new variable as a timer, since that is the data type that we're creating, and it's going to be a new instance of this timer class. We tell the variable that we created what is equal to a new timer class. The class constructor takes two arguments, one required and one that's optional. The class constructor arguments, the first argument, delay, is a mandatory argument. This argument specifies the delay in milliseconds before the timer event is actually fired. The class constructor arguments, the second argument, or the repeat count, is optional, and it signifies the number of times the event fires. If this is left blank, the event will fire infinitely. Every time after the specified delay, using a positive value will cause the event to fire that many times after the specified delay. And you'll see that as we work through the exercises inside the lab. An important note about timers in ActionScript 3 is that the timer you initiate will not start automatically. It must be started with ActionScript. This gives you much more flexibility and better control over your timer events. The code used to start the timer event is mytimer.start and then open and close parentheses, semicolon. And the myTimer is the actual name that you gave the timer itself. So whatever name you use is going to be what you're going to use there. Then you're going to put .start, open and close parentheses, semicolon. And again, where myTimer is the name of the variable that was assigned to the new timer instance when you created it with that timer class. So let's look at some examples of using the timer event in ActionScript 3. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and minimize our presentation and drop down into our development environment. Let me go ahead and open up Flash. And I've got my standard start file open with my branding layer for the start file. So in this tutorial, we're going to discuss using timer events inside of ActionScript 3. Although the OnInFrame event is one way of producing time delays on timer events in the Flash file, it's not the most accurate. The OnInFrame event has some disadvantages based on the speed and power of the CPU that's actually running it. So if we start using the OnInFrame event, you're going to see that in the next group of tutorials. That's when we finish the timer events, we're going to go into the OnInFrame event. But a lot of that's based on the power of the CPU and the amount of processing that's available inside that CPU. So the OnInFrame event can only support moderate frame rates reliably, somewhere between 12 frames per second and 25 frames per second, depending upon the platform that's running it. And that's based on the current CPU that's available at the time of this writing. So I mean, that actually could get either better or a little bit worse depending upon how we go with these different types of processors that we're running into. Because I mean, with all these multi-threading processors, that actually could become a little less accurate. But more important than that is that the frame rates are not consistent and are more based on the amount of activity that's going on inside the hardware platform. And that's the main thing I'm trying to point out here is if we start using the OnInFrame event to do timings inside of our Flash applications, it's going to be very inconsistent. We don't want to do that. So we will look at the OnInFrame event in the next group of tutorials. But for this two-part series, let's talk about the timer events in ActionScript 3. Timer-based events in ActionScript 3 are measured in milliseconds, 1/1000th of a second, and can fire more quickly, are much more accurate, and will perform much more closer to your expectations as a developer. Previous versions of ActionScript used the set interval method, as we talked about in the presentation, for timed and recurring events, and the set timeout method for finite recurring events. ActionScript 3 combines these two approaches into what's called the new timer class inside ActionScript 3. Okay, so the first thing I want to do, let's go ahead and add a couple layers to our timeline. I'm going to insert 2 new layers on my timeline. And the top layer I'm going to call my actions layer. And I'm going to go ahead and lock that layer. And then my next layer I'm going to call graphics. And that's going to be my graphics layer. And for now, I'm just going to actually select that graphics layer because for our first demonstration, I want to put something on our stage. And then I want to do some manipulation with it using our timer event. We don't have anything in the library, so I'm going to go ahead and bring up one of my original graphics. We used this in an earlier tutorial, my little rocket ship graphic. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up inside my file. I'm just going to go ahead and drag an instance of that onto my stage. And I'm going to have to convert this to a movie clip, obviously. So I'm going to grab that graphic. I'm going to use F8. I just want to make this MC Rocket. This way it's going to go into my library, making certain that my registration point's in the center, because I actually want to use that in the center of our stage. And then I'm just going to go ahead and delete it. And the reason I did that, I just wanted to make sure it was in our library so I could actually use it inside my demonstrations. So I'm going to grab my graphics layer. I'm going to go ahead and pull an instance of that MC Rocket onto my stage. Let's go into the properties panel. And I just want to give it an instance name. And I want to call it rocket_MC. And again, we're just doing this so we can actually get at this item using ActionScript. Now I'm just going to go ahead and lock that rocket or that graphics layer. The next thing we need to do in using the timer class is to create an instance of the class in our Flash document. So I'm going to go ahead and select frame 1 of my actions layer. I'm going to open up my actions panel, F9 in Windows, Option F9 in the Macintosh. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this a little bit so we get a little bit more room up here. And the first thing I want to do is I want to create that timer class that we talked about in the presentation. So I'm going to create a variable and I'm going to call it timer. And I'm going to data type this as a timer. And you'll notice as soon as we've done that, ActionScript 3 imports the Flash Utilities timer classes into our document. That's going to be equal to a new timer. Then I'm going to open my parentheses, and these are the 2 arguments that we talked about. I'm going to put down 2000 for my first setting. Remember, that's the required setting. That's our delay. And then I'm going to put a comma and then my repeat count. For this particular example, I'm just going to use 20. And then I'm going to end that with a semicolon. So let's talk real quick about what we just did. The class constructor takes 2 arguments, and we talked about this in our presentation. The first argument in this case, the 2000, is mandatory. This is the time in milliseconds before the timer is run. The 2000 we're using here is equivalent to 2 seconds, because remember, we're talking about milliseconds, 1/1000th of a second. The second argument in this case, the 20, is optional and is the number of times that the timer is going to run. If you leave the second parameter blank, the timer will run infinitely. So every time after the specified delay, the timer will trigger. So if we didn't have that 20 there, every 2 seconds, this is going to run. By the way, I want to go ahead and do a save as, because I don't want to overwrite my start file. Let's go ahead and save this as Flash _1011_1, because this is going to be our first exercise in this file, or in this exercise. So again, that 20 is an option. Don't forget that. That's the number of times we're going to trigger the timer. So let's go ahead and continue with our code. I'm not going to have you watch me type all this on. I'm going to go ahead and copy this from the exercise file. If you have availability to it, you can do that. If not, I'll make certain that I pause here in a moment so that you can actually get caught up with this. And now actually would be a good time to pause if you want to type all this in, and then we'll talk about what we've just entered. All right, so let's talk about this code. We've added a few things here just for the sake of the tutorial that are not needed in the actual timer. The first thing is the variable. The variable I that we've declared. When I was working through the tutorial, I thought it would be a good idea if you could see how the second constructor works in the timer interval, and that's why I've actually created that variable. So I added a variable I, and I also incremented I in the function statement and then traced I to the output panel. So you're actually going to see this count through those 20 iterations, and that's the only reason I did that here. So those 3 lines of code are not really needed to make this work. Anything that's pertaining to this function, like where I've got this here, that's not required. This isn't actually required, again, because it's going back just so you can trace this out in the output panel and you can see this thing counting through the timer itself. Like everything we've dealt with to this point in ActionScript 3, we need to add an event listener to monitor the timer. So what I've done is I've added an event listener and I've told it it's a timer event, and I'm actually listening for this timer. And then when that fires off, I want to perform a function called rotate. So again, I'm listening for the timer. Every time it fires off, I want to perform this function. And if you look at the rotate function, what we're doing, again, it's triggered at a timer event. I'm actually taking that movie clip we put on the stage and I'm rotating it and decreasing the alpha. So I'm actually rotating it 5 degrees every time it fires off, and I'm decreasing its alpha by 0.02 every time it fires off. And then I'm incrementing I, and I'm tracing I to the output panel, and again, just so that you can see the timer counting. We didn't have to put that in there, I just wanted to put it in there so you could see that timer counting down from those 20 iterations. The next thing I want you to notice, very important, I've actually had to start the timer. Remember that variable name right there, timer. This is where we're actually starting that working. The timer does not initiate automatically, and that is the purpose for the timer start line of code. This gives us much greater flexibility when we want these timers to start, unlike earlier versions of ActionScript, which they just ran. Now we actually have control over them, and in my opinion, I kind of relate this to a function. They work just like a function. Until we physically call that timer, it's not going to do anything. And that's what we're doing right here. We're actually calling that timer and telling it to start. So inside our rotate function, we've just declared that we want the timer to do. In this case, we want it to rotate our rocket by 5 degrees and reduce the alpha by 0.02 with each timer activation. So each time it runs, it's going to do that. We're also tracing the I variable for the benefit of the tutorial in the output panel so you can actually see it working. I'm just going to go ahead and save this. You should have everything typed into your display. What we want to do now is I'm going to go ahead and test this movie using Control Enter in Windows or Command Return in the Mac. And I'm going to slide this out of the way here because in our output panel, one, you'll see us, we're rotating to 5 degrees, and in the output panel, you can actually see where we're tracing that timer, the count with that I variable to the output panel so you can actually see it. Let me slide this out of the way so you can see the code that's running in there too. So I mean, it's a good indication of what we're doing. Every 2 seconds it's firing off, it's rotating our rocket 5 degrees, and it's decreasing its alpha. So it's making it more transparent by 0.02 every time it rotates or every time it fires off that timer. And again, just to give you an idea of how these timers work, we're going to do another demonstration, which is actually even going to take it a little bit further and how we'd actually use this in a real live application. All right, so that was pretty cool. I mean, you got to see how we actually initiate a timer and the things that we can do with it on our stage. And now that you understand how the timer event works and how we can add some real functionality to it, let's look at something where we might really want to do with a timer inside of a Flash application. So suppose we're writing an application for a kiosk, and we're going to have 5 different screens on our Flash application. So let's develop that type. Let me go ahead and close out this movie. So the first thing we need to do is add some screens. I'm going to go back to our timeline, and I'm going to add above my branding layer, I'm going to add another layer inside of my timeline. First I want to do save as also. I want to save this as _2. It's going to be our second example inside this demonstration because I don't want to overwrite our first one. So let's add some screens to this. So I added a layer to our timeline. I'm going to name this layer screens. And I want to bring up, let me go ahead and get our panel up. I'm going to go ahead and select that screens layer, and I just want to add some text on there. So I'm going to grab my text tool. I want to make sure I'm on the screens layer now. Grab my text tool, and I'm just going to type in screen 1. And then I'm just going to kind of position this on my stage. Let me make this a little bigger so we can see everything. And I want to make certain that that's actually, I just want that to be static text. I don't want that to be dynamic text. That's supposed to be classic text, static. Very good. And I've got that in there. And now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and copy that frame. And I'm just going to paste 5 of those out to frame 5. So I'm going to give myself 5 frames, and I'm just going to paste them out to frame 5. And then what I want to do is I want to select each one and just change the name so it reflects the page or the layer, the screen that it's on. So it's going to be screen 2, 3, screen 4, and then screen 5. And again, just so we can actually see ourselves going through this. So that's cool. So now we have 5 new screens inside here. So now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and select 5 of each one of these, and I'm just going to insert a blank frame. Because what I want to do now is I just want to go ahead and bring out our stuff. Actually, I don't want to insert a blank frame. I just want to insert frames. Because I want to actually bring out the rest of my frames to that point. And the ActionScript I don't really need to worry about. We'll just insert it anyway. So everything runs out to frame 5. Let me go ahead and delete this. Let me go ahead and delete that. Remove. And I want to go remove. And now I just want to insert a frame there. Now everything runs out to frame 5. So now we're good. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to go through here, and you'll notice as I scroll through this, you'll see our screens changing from 1 through 5. Now what we want to do is we actually want to walk our code through this. And keep in mind that these screens could have completely different material on them. We could have a little presentation, we could have some animation, we could have like a slideshow, whatever we wanted, but we're actually building a kiosk now that's going to self-run from the ActionScript. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to go up into my actions layer. I'm going to select frame 1 of the actions layer, open up my actions panel, F9 in Windows, Option F9 in Mac, and then I'm going to go ahead and minimize, or not minimize, but shrink this down a little bit so I have some more stuff in here. I'm going to go ahead and pull out our code from our previous example, and we're going to start this over again. And the first thing we're going to do, and we've actually done this in a lot of our exercises up to this point, is I'm going to enter that stop. And now we actually need that stop. It's something that a lot of people forget, but that stops the timeline from scrolling through those frames until it's told to scroll. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create another variable. This one's going to be called timer, just like we had done in the past. And I want to data type this as a timer event, and it's going to be equal to a new timer. I'm going to open up my parentheses, and the only thing we're going to have in here is 2000. And again, because that second attribute is optional, I only want the 2000 because I'm going to time this to go every 1 second. I'm sorry, every 2 seconds. You'll notice when we created that new timer class, it imported the classes for that again. I'm also going to create a variable I. I'm going to data type that variable I as a number. And that is going to be equal to 1, and end that with a semicolon. Let's go ahead and save those changes. And now what I want to do is I'm going to go into the exercise file, and I'm actually going to copy a little bit of code so you don't have to watch me type all this. And I'm going to come right down below where we declared our variable I, and I'm going to add an add event listener for that timer event that we created with the new class of timer. And again, just like before, we're listening for the timer event timer, and when it triggers, when that 2 seconds is triggered, it's going to run a function called proceed. And right below that, I'm actually starting that timer. So I'm actually calling the timer to start. Remember, that is a requirement. Now the next thing we got to do is let's go ahead and create that proceed function. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this from the exercise file. Come right down below there, and let's go ahead and paste this on. And we're going to talk about what all this is about. Let me go ahead and save those changes. I'm going to go ahead and bring this up. Just want to make sure I'm doing everything that I'm doing correct here, which we are. I actually have a conditional statement inside this timer, so I'm going to go ahead and do some indenting so that you can see what we're doing here and actually follow this through so it's nice and clean. And I'm going to talk through all the different pieces of this code as we get in here. So just relax. Let's go ahead and save those changes. And now let's actually Now would be a great time to pause if you want to type this in, and then we're going to talk through the code that I've just put in here. All right, so the first thing we did, the stop. That stop function is a built-in function in ActionScript. We've used it in a lot of the previous tutorials, but it stops our timeline from scrolling. At the top of the code, stops the timeline from automatically running when you start the movie file. This is an area that most new developers forget when writing their code, and it drives them crazy because they test their movie and it just keeps scrolling through and scrolling through and scrolling through, and nothing seems to work, and it's because they forgot to put the stop in. And we've actually practiced that in a lot of the earlier tutorials, so you should be used to it by now. We then declare the timer variable just as we did in the previous example. The timer variable name can be any name that you assign. Just remember that all the references must be to that name that you use, and they are case sensitive. So whatever we name this timer variable, when we set up this new timer class, whenever we refer to it, it's got to be with that name. Notice in this example, we did not use the optional parameters for iterations. That means that this time will run until we stop the timer. So it's going to continue to run until we stop the timer, because remember, we didn't use that optional parameter for iterations in this timer itself. The next line declares our variable I, which we're using for our counter. Again, as in the last example, this is not needed. It's just helping us troubleshoot the code in the event we run into a problem. So I've actually just put that in there to just trace this I to my output panel. Now we add our event listener to listen for our timer event and assign a function to the event listener. We then start the timer. Then we write our function, and we want to execute each time the timer event occurs. In this particular function, we've written the following. So line 1 increments our variable. That should have a semicolon there. That increments our variable I. Line 2 traces variable I to the output panel. Line 3 moves our timeline to the next frame, and that's what this next frame function is inside ActionScript. It actually just moves our timeline to the next frame. Line 4 rotates the movie clip on the stage. So just like we had done in the past, we're actually rotating that rocket underscore movie clip that's part of our graphics layer. Then we begin an if statement, checks to see if the value of I is greater than 5. Remember, we only have 5 slides in our presentation. So if the value of I exceeds 5, we perform the if command. So if this evaluates to true, if I is greater than 5, we go back and set I to 1. So we go back to frame 1. This is what's actually setting it back to the beginning. So if we put more slides in here, obviously we'd want to change that value for that conditional statement. We trace the output to the panel with I again. We move that playhead back to frame 1, so we go back to our frame 1, go to and play frame 1. That's what the go to and play function is inside of ActionScript. And then we do a couple of other different things we'll discuss in a few minutes. We're actually removing event listeners, and we're resetting our timer event and all that stuff. But I mean, that's stuff that you don't, we're basically doing this just to reset the timer. So we can do this function a couple different ways. We'll discuss the differences between resetting the timer and removing the event listener, the latter being the preferred, as it cleans up the memory and avoids memory issues in the event the application runs for an extended period of time. So it's always a good idea if you're going to have a kiosk, especially if this were a kiosk, say you had 50 or 60 slides in here, and you were running this and it's going to run for an entire day. In order to clean things up, when we reset this and go back to frame 1, it's always a good idea to remove that event listener, because it cleans up all your memory and it's basically gives it a fresh start for the next iteration through there. And it's one of the things you'll learn as we play around with more of the essential trainings in Flash ActionScript 3. Removing event listeners can become very important as far as cleaning up your code. So let's go ahead and test this movie. I'm going to do a control enter in Windows and a command return in the Mac. And you'll see now, hang on, we've got a problem. Let's go ahead and stop. I actually have, it tells me frame 1, line 4, expecting semicolon before my minus. So I've forgotten a semicolon. And that's not a minus, that's an equal. So my variable timer equals a new timer. And I actually like to leave these in, these little issues that we run into as we're testing these movies, or these little errors that we run into, because I think it's good for you to see that we all make these mistakes. You're going to run into these as you're testing your movies. So it's just a matter of identifying what it is and correcting it. Let's go ahead and test that movie again. Control enter in Windows, command return in the Mac. And now every 2 seconds we should see this rotate and move to the next screen. You'll notice we're going through our screen numbers, and you'll also notice here we're actually seeing that trace to the output panel just like we'd done in the previous demonstration. But keep in mind, you could have anything on these screens. You could have additional animation. You could have slide presentations. There's a lot of different things you could do here. I just did this as a demonstration so you can see we're walking through those frames and we're actually manipulating a movie clip. You could manipulate anything. I mean, I've seen some of these functions that are just huge. But again, you're just setting up an application that walks through frame by frame, and based on how we wrote our code, when it goes and restarts it, we're cleaning up all our event listeners, we're cleaning up our function, and then we're restarting it from the very beginning. That's the go to and play one function. This is the actual frame number we're going to. And we're starting it from the very beginning and going through it again. Keep in mind, if you had a title screen on frame 1, say for instance we use frame 1 strictly as an introduction, we only wanted that to play once, we could actually have this go to and play frame 2, so we wouldn't go back and repeat frame 1. Let's go ahead and test that movie again. And this time we'd only play 2 through 5. Once it goes through the first time, it would never go back and play 1 again. It would actually go to frame 2 and start from 2 and move forward. You'll see that right now. We're going to jump to frame 2. Actually, we actually did some funny stuff there. I want to walk this through this again, because it actually scrolled through. That's interesting. Go to and, oh, I know why. I probably wanted to make this a go to and stop, frame 2. Save that change. Let's go ahead and test it one more time. That should be go to and stop, and then the timer will take it forward. Let's see if that makes a difference, because there are a lot of different built-in functions inside of ActionScript 3 for manipulating the timeline. Yeah, there we go. See, that time it went to 2 and stopped. So again, there's a lot of different ways that we can do this, a lot of different things that we can do with these timers. And we could also reset the timer. But again, you can reset the timer, but you still really want to remove the event listeners as you're going through these. In the next tutorial, we're actually going to go into TimerEvents, a second part to this, because there's actually some more things inside these timers that we can use inside of our applications, and I want you to be aware of them, some more parameters. All right, so let's review what we covered inside that first TimerEvents tutorial. So inside part 1, we discussed the difference between TimerEvents and the OnInFrame Event in ActionScript 3. And the OnInFrame Event tutorial is coming up, so you'll see why we tend not to use that when we want precise timing inside of our applications. We made the comparison between the ActionScript 2 set interval and the set timeout methods as compared to the timer event. And they're not, set interval and set timeout methods are no longer used. We really want to use the timer event to do this stuff going forward. We built our very first timer. We used the I++ to iterate a time or a counter inside of our function so we could actually trace output to the output panel. And once again, we looked at the properties of an object. We built a navigation sequence through our timeline using the timer event as if we were running a self-running kiosk. So we actually built those 5 frames so that we could actually walk it through the frames of a self-running kiosk. And you saw how we actually initiate that and actually how we cleared that event listener when we restarted the timer so it stayed nice and clean as it was running. In the next tutorial, we'll continue our discussion on TimerEvents in ActionScript 3. If you have any comments or suggestions on the tutorials, please let me know. There's an email link right above this video. You can actually just drop me a line and say, hey, you know, I'd like to see something else in this. I think you missed a point or whatever. I love hearing from the users of the website. Look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial.